days, we tend to point to government austerity. That is the aggressive program of public sector cutbacks and belt tightening that governments claim is the only cure for these tough economic times. We point to this as a provincial policy responsible for the eroding quality and accessibility of higher education. But the reality is that public funding of higher ed has been in decline for some time now, with serious implications for university faculty, students, staff, and society in general. It's an issue that affects all of us in different ways. We hope that tonight's event will help us get working better together towards solutions. Similar town hall meetings are being organized on campuses across the province in the coming months. We encourage you to connect with OCUFA on Facebook and Twitter. Everything's up on the board. And spread the word about these events to your friends and colleagues at other schools. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you our moderator and the panelists. I will do that and then I'll hand it off to our moderator. So Nick Falvo, he's a PhD candidate at Carleton University School of Public Policy Administration. He's spent 3 years on the executive of Carleton's Graduate Students Association, that's Local 78 of the Canadian Federation of Students. He's also spent 3 years as a member of Carleton's Senate, and he's currently a member of Carleton's Board of Governors. Our speakers tonight, we're very fortunate to have them with us. First off, David Macdonald. He's a senior economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. He heads the Centre's Alternative Federal Budget Project that takes a fresh look at how the federal government could build a better Canada. David is also a frequent media commentator on national public policy issues. Tyler Chamberlin is an associate professor at the Telfer School of Management at the University of Ottawa. He received his PhD from the University of Manchester. His research focuses on industrial innovation at both the sector and firm levels. He teaches in the area of international business and corporate strategy. He serves as the chair of the Financial Analysis Committee of the Association of Professors of the University of Ottawa, APUO. He's a member of its collective bargaining committee and is a member of the pension committee of the University of Ottawa Pension Plan. Joel Westheimer is University Research Chair in Democracy and Education at the University of Ottawa and an education columnist for CBC Radio's Ottawa Morning Show. He received his PhD from Stanford University and his BSc from Princeton. He's co-founder and executive director of Democratic Dialogue, a research collaborative dedicated to the critical exploration of democratic ideals in education and society. Joel grew up in New York City, where he was also a public school teacher. He taught at Stanford and at New York University before moving to Ottawa. And Anna Goldfinch is the VP External of the Carleton University Graduate Students Association, the treasurer of the National Graduate Caucus and the National Executive Representative-elect for the Canadian Federation of Students, Ontario. Anna has been part of the student movement since 2007 during her first year of CEGEP at Athleticsville, Quebec. She received her undergraduate degree in Community, Public Affairs and Policy Studies from Concordia University and is currently completing her master's degree in Public Admin at Carleton. Thank you to everybody, and over to Nick.
Thank you. I just have two main messages right now. The first is that I have been asked to be a strict timekeeper. Presenters have been given 10 minutes each, and I've been given a mandate to enforce that. And that is in the interest of having as much participation and feedback afterwards from the audience. Second major message I wanted to give is that the Q&A afterwards isn't really a Q&A as much as it's an opportunity for people in the audience to talk about what they've been doing and talk about what their groups are doing and what they'd like to see done on the issue of post-secondary education and austerity. So while you're welcome and encouraged to ask questions at that time, you're also welcome and encouraged to talk a bit about your views on the issue and what you've been doing. So without further ado, I will hand it over to David Macdonald.
As Nick said, I'm with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. We are a member-funded organization doing progressive policy work here in Canada. We just opened our Ontario office, and so I'll just make a quick plug for the Ontario office that because we're membership funded, we don't rely on government funding. If you're not a member of the CCPA, please become a member of the CCPA and support the kind of work that we're doing. Here today is to look at some of the overall trends in what's happening, not so much the university sector, what's happening overall in Ontario around deficits and austerity and so on. And so I'll breeze through this relatively quickly given my tight time constraints. What I want to do to start off with is to really get a 10,000 mile view of what's going on in Canada, what has been going on over the past 20 or 30 years. This is a graph of government spending as proportion to GDP in Canada and the US. And you can see that what's really happening over time on the real top level view here is that government spending is going down, and it's going down significantly. This is the present right here. We've got projections going forward given provincial and federal budgets. And so you can see that over the next couple years, we're going to hit new historic lows in terms of government outlays as a proportion of GDP. So this is important to keep in mind, despite the talk of deficits and austerity and so on, that behind all of this is a program of privatization, of lower government spending, of risk transfer from public to private, and also gains from public to private. So if you do well, you can make a lot more now than you could 20 or 30 years ago. Yeah?
Are military expenditures in there?
Yeah, all government expenditures should be in there. And so when we start talking about deficits and austerity, what we're really talking about is more privatization, less government programs, less government funding, costs being downloaded to lower levels of governments, and costs being downloaded to individuals. In the case of universities, it's higher tuition rates. So I'm sure you're all well aware of the deficit story here in Ontario. This is a compilation of the various estimates year by year of how big the deficit's going to be. And so you can see here last year, this was the initial deficit, sort of 2 years forward, it's going to be quite high, and then they revised it a little bit further down, and then you get a little closer and it goes further down. This is this year, so 12-13, so this is ending in March of this year. And so again, you can see in Ontario, these are deficit estimates. The initial estimate 2 years out was over 15 billion. It's come down to around 15. And the last estimate that was released just earlier on this week, as Dwight Duncan was retiring from the finance portfolio, we're down again to about $12 billion. So you can see that the original deficit scare that you would have heard from the Drummond report, for instance, have been revised significantly downwards. And so what's happening here is you get the big scare of the deficit up front. Austerity somehow is needed, massive cutbacks in government spending are needed, but it turns out that when push comes to shove and we start to get into the future, it turns out these deficits are not nearly as big as they were initially forecast. And so this push towards austerity is really a severing of the link between what we pay in taxes and what we receive in services. So the idea, of course, is that you can continue to cut back government services, you continue to cut back funding for a variety of things like universities, and you won't see a decrease in service, which is obviously false. The claim is that we can cut taxes and not cut services. And I think finally, and perhaps most importantly for you folks, is that we can cut back public wages in order to save on government expenditures, and therefore force public sector workers to bear the cost of public services. In essence, to transfer to public service workers. I mean, one of the things we need to remember here in the history of Ontario is that there's a real forgotten history here. This is budget balance over the past 10 years in Ontario. And you can see that all throughout the 2000s here, government expenditures were going up, but in fact government revenues were going up as much, if not more, making up for those increases in government expenditures. And so what we're seeing in terms of this deficit hysteria is that the recession is what caused the deficit, not overspending. And this is something that's often forgotten in the complicated political mess. But in fact, it's the recession that caused the deficit, not the spending. And so in employment, we're seeing declines in government spending as a share of GDP. We're seeing some small increase in government spending, particularly in the short term in Ontario, but that's going to decrease as the stimulus spending wears off. Yeah? Oh, that's my 5-minute mark. I thought you were going to And so here again, this is just nominal GDP in Ontario. Curing the recession is going to cure the deficit, or could cure the deficit. I mean, you can take a look here at this gap, which is worth about $70 billion between what we are actually at in Ontario in terms of GDP growth and what we would have been at if growth had been much higher, if governments had been committed to economic growth and employment instead of balancing the books as rapidly as possible. And so, I mean, if we walk through this, misplaced austerity at the wrong time, can not only be self-defeating, but it can actually be quite destructive in the extreme. First of all, we get is a recession causes a deficit. revenues drop as people make less money, corporations make less money and pay less in tax. Austerity, quote unquote, solves the deficit by starting to cut back on program spending. But the problem is that once you start cutting back on program spending, you also see macroeconomic effects. That is to say that you also start to see declines in revenues. And when this gets to the extreme side, we can see heavy depressive effects of big cutbacks in government spending. So this is the type of thing that we're seeing in the UK with the triple dip recession, 3 recessions over the course of the past 5 years. It's what we're seeing with depression level, lack of growth in southern European countries. And even the IMF starting to look back on some of the things that have happened in Europe over the past couple of years, say that they're underestimating the effects of government austerity on economic growth. And so as Ontario leads down this path towards austerity, we're likely to see declines in economic growth and declines in revenue being caused by this austerity implemented by the provincial government. So what could we do about this? Well, if we had a jobs approach instead of a balance the books as quickly as possible approach, I think what we could have is a progressive jobs agenda, something that's different from what's being spouted right now by the Liberals and the Conservatives at the provincial level. This would be something that would resist public sector downsizing and in fact focus on creating jobs for people in a time when people are willing to work, they just can't find jobs, particularly for youth in fact. We could see increased public capital spending, particularly infrastructure. We did see a blip of that right after the recession in 2008-9, but it's something that could be continued. We could really use, particularly in Ontario, an active industrial policy that focuses on manufacturing and high quality jobs in the manufacturing sector, which has been completely lacking as the focus shifts to raw resource extraction in the West. And despite the fact that that's somewhat a federal issue, it could very much be a provincial issue, and the provincial government could focus, I think, a lot more on an active industrial strategy. And developing Northern Ontario and sort of focusing more on public enterprises. So since we are the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, here are some alternatives. Instead of cutting back a whole variety of programs, if you wanted to balance the budget, if you were hell-bent on balancing the budget by 2017-18, at present the deficit looks like it's be around $6 billion. It may be less as we go forward. You remember that graph prior to this where these estimates are overestimating the deficit quite consistently. Some small increases in the income tax rate, particularly at the high end, which polls fabulously with most people, could raise about $2 billion. Changing the way that the employer health tax is implemented could raise $3 billion. And importantly, restoring the corporate tax rate to where it was at pre-recession levels could raise about $2 billion. So there are absolutely alternatives, particularly on the tax side, that could offset this deficit if this was your hell-bent priority. And so I think that particularly when we're looking forward, it's important to understand that it's not cut here or cut there. We have to cut. It has to be austerity. We have to balance the budget. There are definitely alternatives here, and here's a couple of them. So just to summarize in the last minute here, I think that there are some obvious truths that we need to understand as we go forward, despite all the rest of the rhetoric that's going on. The first one is that the recession is what caused the deficit, not overspending. The second one is that misplaced austerity can be detrimental to macroeconomic features like unemployment and also to government revenue, and in an extreme case can actually cause another recession or depression. The third one is that we can afford strong social programs, and we have had those strong social programs in the past, and we have paid for them. And so we can see that despite the fact that we're spending a lot less today than we were 20 or 30 years ago on social programs, we could go back to that level if we wanted to, and we could pay for it if we wanted to, given the GDP that we have. And finally, we can pay for these things through small changes in the tax system without having to attack public sector workers and their wages and so on.
So I'm going to talk about things at the University of Ottawa level, and it's both more encouraging and less encouraging. Well, this is the start of the encouraging bit, right? So this is the financial situation of the University of Ottawa, assets of approaching $1.8 billion and liabilities of somewhere just around $800 million. So a strong balance sheet situation, as we'd say in a business school, as I am at. certainly we're solvent and strong. Now, if you look at how things have changed over time, this is 2001, 2002 revenues and 2011, 2012 revenues, right, side by side. And so you can see that spending by the university, or revenue, the revenues of the university have increased substantially. There's good reason, we'll get to that in a moment. The net assets, too, have increased. And a big part of this, of course, has been a lot of building that's gone on campus, and we benefit from that. That's, we can debate about how much should be spent on capital projects and building new buildings on campus versus how much should be spent on the delivery of educational services on a year-to-year basis. But the result is, we have an increase, a large increase in net assets. And what's a bit of an issue maybe for some of us at the APUO, the university has made a decision to stockpile a whole bunch of cash, somewhere in the neighborhood of $350 million in cash and short-term assets. So, they're pretty good. They're pretty strong at present. Now, this is how they've accumulated that money. This is how they've increased this cash position, especially, okay, over time. They've run surpluses, big operating surpluses, and I think that should really matter, especially to the students in the room, the undergraduate and the graduate students, and of course it matters to the faculty members and everyone else as well, because this means that in a system that is tight, in a system where austerity has been around for a while, right, that somehow we're able to deliver all the education we're obliged to give in a year, and yet we've got cash left over, right? And so, is that really a good situation to see? I mean, on a practical level, I say with my business school hat, the university is in a strong position. It's got a nice buffer, a real nice buffer against potential cuts in funding, and if anything happens, if a building happens to fall down, or something disastrous occurs, we've got money to deal with these sorts of problems. But when I look at this, I see this as education not delivered. I see this as an educational deficit. This is less education going into a generation of our students at the University of Ottawa, and this concerns me. And there's more.
What the heck happened in 2007 there?
Wasn't that a great year? $100 million they put in the bank. Interestingly, the recession hits in 2008, and my colleagues, my faculty colleagues, if you're here long enough, will remember the optimization push. We optimized the university. And thank goodness we did, right? Because we almost didn't make $20 million. We didn't make $20 million in surplus that year. It's quite concerning, 2009, right? But we've rebounded. Don't worry, we've rebounded. These are tabled budget. Now, I got to admit, this is one table I didn't update. This is the tabled budgets going back 1 year, and you see that going forward, things look pretty good. What's interesting, and one of the things that Okufa our friends from Okufa will tell you, is that there is absolutely a gap year on year, and this is done across the university sector, between what the university projects, says that its surplus will be, and what it ends up being. You probably aren't surprised to hear that back in 2007, or 2006, when they tabled the budget for 2007, well, at the University of Ottawa, we tabled the budget after the year started. Not a good process, but anyways. They never said they were going to make $100 million, right? That was never articulated as the plan. This just, happens. Well, where did the extra money come from, right? The extra revenues? Increases in enrollments, 47%, full-time, part-time students. That's graduate, undergraduate, everybody together. Now just over 40,000 students over this period of time. Now, 48% or so student growth, 42% faculty growth. Again, I would call that 6% there, an educational deficit, potentially, right? Because that means that you have less access to regular full-time people on campus, right? And you have more students competing for the shortened sort of attention of academics. Well, this I'm not going to spend so much time on, just to show you where salaries have been as a percentage of operating expenditures. One of the criticisms that could be leveled and raises great point that David made about, you know, salaries of public servants and of universities, for example, being the problem or being the issue. Well, this is academic salaries as a percentage of operating expenditures, pretty flat. And that is for a whole bunch of universities across Ontario, right? And so when you look at how the spending has happened, it's certainly not gone to spend disproportionately on faculty members, okay? Hopefully that's encouraging. The U of O situation, I'll spend even less time here. This just shows that we are sadly underpaid at the University of Ottawa. This is the discrepancy between our salaries at the University of Ottawa and our comparator group, pretty much across the board for full profs, even worse for associate profs, and worse still for assistant profs. So, you know, this is where you go, oh, you know, oh. Well, what it all translates into is a student to faculty ratio that is at the University of Ottawa that is second highest in the country. Now, you know, the only piece of people higher is the University of Toronto. And I think this is kind of an interesting issue, you know, to sort of to conclude on and to think about. You know, of course, the University of Ottawa would love to be the University of Toronto, right? Aspires to it in terms of research ranking and in terms of a whole bunch of levels. And in this regard, we're almost there. But you know, I think this is a real problem, and it goes to the wider issue of trying to compete at an international level with very limited resources. Yeah.
Is that the latest statistics for that?
I think there may be 2012 out. There's another one I need to update. Yeah. So that gives you a sense of where things are. This just to let you know, is what we do, sort of the financial analysis committee. So turn it over there. Thanks.
So KUFA put together a really nice panel here because we have a very complementary perspectives and not too much overlap, especially because I'm not an expert in higher education or finance or the analysis that you saw David do. But after I got fired from NYU for supporting graduate students' right to organize, I suddenly had this second career of going on the lecture circuit and talking about higher education. So that's been fun for the last 10 years, but I do have something to contribute here, and it's this. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the impact of this increasing privatization that you heard about from the previous two little talks. On education, right? On what happens at the university and how it does. I sometimes feel like when I'm doing this, I'm in a science fiction novel and I'm like the guy who comes back in time from the dystopic future, because I study K-12 education primarily, and what we see in K-12 education is disastrous. And I'll explain in a number of ways, and it's sort of a bellwether for what's coming our way in higher ed. So for example, we have this extreme and myopic focus on standardization and testing and reducing the curriculum down to the bare minimum of subject areas like just math and literacy, as if whether kids can add numbers and whether they can read is the only thing they need to get out of school, right? We have value-added measures in K-12 education. We have teacher tests and salary merit pay schemes, right, where salaries are linked to the performance of teachers, students on test scores. And now here in in Ottawa we have Bill 115 and so forth, right? So, and I feel like I'm coming from the dystopic future, as I said, because these things are coming to a university near you, right? And they are already present in many universities in the US and coming to Canada as well. And that is the reduction of the higher education curriculum to institutions of job training, basically, and a very narrow focus on educational goals. But before I go there, I just do want to revisit something that David brought up, and I'm going to say it in a slightly different way, but I know he was saying it too, which is, who declared this time of austerity, right? What does austerity mean, right? One of the most fantastic things about the Occupy movement was that it helped reframe our national and international conversation from around to one of inequality, right? And we talked about inequality. But now we've boomeranged back and we are constantly talking about austerity, right? This shortage of money and why, therefore, we need to cut back on things like education. We need to optimize, and that's unfortunately too many of us, even academics, have bought into this idea of austerity. Who introduced me? Mentioned that I was a commentator on CBC Radio, and a number of times already they've asked me what from education should be cut in this time of austerity, right? And in Ontario, the savings called for in education are often cited in millions of dollars. Sometimes policymakers talk in hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? Gosh, we have to cut funding for a student assistance center that cost $87,000 per year to run, right? But who designated education and other public services like health as the unique target for savings, right? David said some of these figures, and I'm just going to repeat a couple of them. Restoring a 14% provincial corporate tax would recoup $2 billion annually, right? Restoring the corporate capital tax just for banks and adding 2 percentage points of tax on personal income for those making over $500,000 would collect a further $1.2 billion annually, right? Stock options are taxed at half the rate that Canadians pay on employment income, which of course favors those who are fortunate enough to have stock. The corporate tax rate in Ontario is going to drop to 25% this year in 2013. If you look at US numbers, of course, they become even more jarring, the gap between the 1% and the 99%. And in fact, those numbers are so glaring that Gary Alperovitz calls them medieval numbers, right? So nobody should be asking educators at any level what universities should be cutting in this time of austerity. These kind of inane questions from the media and from politicians and from policymakers about so-called times of austerity that always begin with what program of immense public benefit should we cut, should instead begin with how should our public revenue system be adjusted in this time of radically medieval economic injustice, right? That's the question I'd like to hear. 60 years ago, former US Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis said that we can either have wealth concentrated in a small few or we can have democracy, but we can't have both. Right? And if he was right, then democracy today in North America is in grave danger. So what does all this have to do with education? Put simply, I think that the massive allocation of national and global resources away from the provision of public goods and towards what we've begun to uncritically call the free market economy is a matter of concern for educators at any level, right? We have Bill 115 here, but if we had looked south of the border, we would have seen this coming long before, and some people did. A few miles south of the border in Michigan, Indiana, Nevada, Nebraska, Wisconsin, right? It was all happening there. Bill 115 is a shot across the bow of all public sector employees, not just teachers, and it's very likely, if our neighbors to the south are any example, to move that way. Some of you probably saw this thing that flew around the internet. I loved it, so I'm just going to read it to you. It was this question that said, Do you remember when teachers, public employees, Planned Parenthood, NPR, and PBS crashed the stock market, wiped out half our pensions, took trillions in TARP money, gave themselves billions in bonuses, and paid no taxes? Yeah, me neither. And that's the kind of thing that I think that we need to push back with. But until we do, there is this trend, as you heard already, of the corporatization of education, and that affects the curriculum. Let me say one other thing about the Occupy Wall Street and this discourse of inequality. Interestingly, although it raised the idea of inequality, and it's did that incredibly across Canada, the US, and the world, that there is huge conversations about inequality now, in education circles, that very conversation about inequality has been hijacked to mean inequality in test scores only. Okay, so when they talk about inequality, they say, you see how unequal things are, we need to make sure that all kids get the same test scores. The fallout of that from an education reform perspective is, of course, massive standardization and massive corporatization of the curriculum, and that's what I fear will happen at universities also. A second thing that happens in K-12 education that is likely and is already happening in higher education is the shunning and tamping down of controversy, of ideologically controversial topics in schools. So we have many reports, like my research center is doing research now in a bunch of schools in Ontario and in the US, where teachers are reporting feeling pressure not to raise controversial topics, for example, fair taxation policies, in classes for fear that they will be reprimanded or disciplined. And there are, in fact, examples and even legal cases of teachers being suspended or pushed out or fired for bringing up controversial topics in schools. Now, universities are still safe, mostly because administrators think that whatever happens in a classroom is completely irrelevant, right, to life. But as soon as those conversations actually have relevance, for example, the protests in Quebec, the student protests in Quebec, or when we talk about issues of whether the free market economy is the best way to go or what things, as soon as those have relevance, there are likely to be pressure on professors as well to cut back on those kinds of conversations. So let me say one final point in my last 30 seconds, and that's this. One of the other aspects of a corporate agenda in higher education is this idea of a meritocracy myth, right? Because in the free market, everyone succeeds and fails by their own merits. This is a fantastic situation in higher ed, of course, where there are 1 or 2 jobs for every 1,000 applicants, right? But what we've all been cajoled into doing is feeling like we are all individual entrepreneurs on a campus that used to be more about a collective mission for the public good. And the more we move towards this idea of the rock star academic, that a few of us will succeed. You remember that, I don't know if some of you watched West Wing, but there's this great speech by Martin Sheen, President Bartlett in it, right, where his staff is just beside themselves saying, why do people vote against their own interests, right? And why do we, why do we as professors buy this story that if we just work hard enough and if we're recognized for how smart we are, that we will be that rock star professor, right? And Bartlett says it's because the American dream is founded on the idea that everyone will once be rich, that you too can be rich, right? Not that you are now. So people are voting on the idea that they will be part of the 1%. And in academia, we have that same situation, except it's not about money, it's about rock star status in the academy, and soon it will be about who has tenure at all. Thanks.
I'm the Vice President External at the Graduate Student Association at Carleton University. I'm going to talk a little bit about the student perspective and how austerity towards post-secondary education affects students. And so I think it's important that we talk about that austerity in Ontario towards post-secondary education has been going on for a long time. It wasn't just this government, but has been a trend. And so what we're seeing is a massive divestment from our universities, and for students what that results in is higher tuition fees, larger class sizes, full-time faculty to student ratios are going up. And so it's definitely, we're seeing a quality as well as a cost. So a diminishing in quality and an increase in cost for students. And just to put some numbers to this, in the last 20 years, average tuition fees have increased by 370% in our province, meaning that students today pay 5 times what students paid in 1992. So essentially, our post-secondary education system was slyly privatized. It was sneaky and quiet and happened not in a press conference and with a big announcement, but with small incremental policy changes that quietly changed the way that our universities are funded. So just a few more numbers. In 1993, public funding accounted for 71% of operating funding. And now, less than 50. So we're looking at less than the majority of funding of universities in Ontario are funded by public dollars. What they're being funded by are different things, and I'm going to talk a little bit about donor agreements. But one of the things is just increasing costs for students, and we're seeing that in the rise of tuition fees. And so, bringing it more into the recent context, under the McGuinty government, students watch as tuition fees increased as much as 71% in 6 years, leaving students in Ontario paying the highest tuition fees than any other student in the province. Also, I should just say that at the same time, we have the largest class sizes, so I always say that Ontario is the best at being the worst in terms of students in public post-secondary, or not even public anymore, education. And so, obviously, with this rise in tuition fees comes a rise in student debt, and these numbers are just as frightening. Students today owe the provincial government about $2.4 billion, double what they owed in 2006. And currently, the average student debt for private and public loans is $37,000 after a 4-year degree, and that's an increase by 460% in the last 15 years. So think about doing a graduate degree afterwards. And so as a graduate student at Carleton University, the impacts of these policies are very clear, right? Because we're living them day to day. One of the things that I can definitely point to is this idea of student as cash cow. And it's happening more and more, and we're being pitted against each other because some of us we're bigger cash cows than the other ones. So for example, international students are really bearing the brunt of this. They're seeing that public opinion in a way is definitely wrong on this one, and people say, you know what, if they're coming to our country, they can pay exorbitant fees. And so governments are getting away with letting universities charge completely deregulated fees. And so what we're seeing is this intense recruitment of international students to fund that gap in, the public sector has been pulling away, so the government of Ontario has been funding us less. Institutions are having to find more money, and so they're recruiting these international students, and it's starting to get worrisome how it's being done. And one of the examples of this, I don't know if anyone has ever heard of Navitas or CultureWorks. These are two private companies that get invited onto campuses to do international recruitment for students that may not be up to the standards of the university to be accepted. They do language training, and then the students are bridged into university programs. And we fought Navitas on our campus, and we won, and then CultureWorks came on. And so we're going to be recruiting massive amounts of international students to fund this gap. Without looking at increasing the quality of education that we're getting to match this immense new student body. Another thing that I wanted to talk about as well is changing the nature of education. For me as a graduate student in public administration, we're encouraged not to do a thesis. And so I'm a cash cow in the sense that my course-based master's degree is a great way for them to pack 40 of us into a seminar where no one cares if you've done your readings. Just sit there, pay your tuition, and get out. We gave you a master's degree. Good. Okay. So we're really seeing this diminishing quality of education on our campuses, and yet we're paying more and more for it. In other ways that we're seeing it as well, we're seeing a loss of student space, and so this corporatization, not of just education, but of our campuses. Sections of it are being bought off by private donor agreements, and we're losing academic freedom because of it. And if you look at the Riddell Agreement in Carleton's case, it's one we're real proud of. And the other thing is there was a ton of media coverage on the SFUO, the Student Federation here at the University of Ottawa's food bank. And people are shocked. Administrators, when we tell them, that food bank usage is up, they're like, students need food banks? It's like, we're starving. You're literally charging us so much, we're starving. And you're shocked. And there's this huge disconnect between what students are experiencing in the classroom and what they're paying out of their pocket and what administrators and people in society think that we're doing. And so, as a graduate student myself, and there are 58,000 other graduate students in Ontario, we're part of the 700,000 students who are completely ineligible for the 30% off grant that was promised by the Liberals in the 2011. So they realized that tuition is too high. They addressed it head on in the last election. It got students to vote for them, and then massively excluded tons of students with this program. And graduate students are being targeted in so many ways. And so the 30% off grant was one of these. Another one was childcare, and we're seeing it in all kinds of services like healthcare, housing, and employment. But the example I want to point to is childcare, because it's something that I've been working on in the past month. The City of Ottawa told graduate students that we were no longer eligible for the childcare subsidy. So you had to be low income to qualify, and if you were a graduate student, you qualified. And what they said was, well, listen, we need to prioritize people who need it the most. And you're job ready. You've got a bachelor's degree. So go out and get a job. And students were encouraged to drop out of school if they needed to gain access to childcare. And it's funny, I made the joke when I met with City of Ottawa officials that they must have done a lot of stretching before the meeting, because I've never seen someone try and pass the buck up and down at the same time. They kept saying that the provincial government, it was their fault because the envelope was too small. But they also said that the institutions need to step up and fund students better so that they can afford childcare. And it's like the government of Ontario not only is underfunding our education and making it unaffordable, inaccessible, but they're also underfunding the programs that make it so that we can get to school, just like childcare. So, as some of you also might know, the Ministry of Training Colleges and Universities released this paper called Centers of Creativity, Knowledge, Innovation. Fun fact about that one, I wrote a little paper on it, and the word innovation comes up 37 times, not including the title. In the paper, the word creativity is mentioned once. It's on the first page. And so it rolled out this series of reforms for Ontario universities, which included 3-year degrees, which again is this cash cow idea of churning us out as fast as possible and not really respecting the traditional academy. And so the goal of these proposals were really clear, which was to further cut funding from post-secondary education and to put the burden on students to be paying for it, but the quality wasn't going to be managed. So at Carleton University, we've really understood the importance of organizing against this, and we stress the importance of working with unions at our campus. So we have something called Campus United, where we meet with faculty unions, the teaching assistant union, the staff union on our campus, to be talking about how we can fight back against this austerity, and we can talk a little bit later in the question and answer period about the organizing that we do. And so I think it's really important that we acknowledge that it doesn't necessarily have to be like this. Something I like to point to is that the Reach and Higher framework, which had tuition increasing by 5% every year, has now gone through an entire cohort of students from the beginning of their bachelor's degree to the end of their bachelor's degree. And so what we just saw was students who now know nothing other than tuition fee increasing every year as the norm. This is status quo. And being from Quebec, to me, this was such a stark I mean, it was a surprise, right? It was something that I wasn't used to, and I think that we need to be rocking the boat a little bit more and telling students that they deserve better here in Ontario.
That's great. We're at exactly 8 p.m., which is perfect. They all kept to within their time, so thank you so much for doing that. We're planning to be here until 9, right? That's the official plan. So I'd like to now open it up to comments, feedback, questions. Okay, I'll throw one out there if there's a pause. I guess this would be a question primarily for David, although anyone can chime in. I used to sit on the working group of the Ontario Alternative Budget, and every year what we would do is we would propose tax increases, but generally we would target them at higher income earners for reasons I probably don't have to explain to most people in this room. And then one year, one of our co-chairs, Hugh McKenzie, said to us, he says, this year I want to propose something different. He said, we always point the finger, and he said, I know we all agree that in principle for a variety of political economy reasons that's the right thing. But he says, in terms of optics, he says, this year I want to propose that everyone take a tax increase. Lower income earners, a very small one, mind you, but that everyone sort of do it just for reasons of optics. So we're not accused of just asking one group to foot the bill. And it was just a strategy. It wasn't so much in principle that we thought it was right. And I'm just wondering, David and others, if you wish, whether you think that's a good strategy or not, or whether you think it's okay to sort of say, look, you guys are the higher income earners, you pay more.
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely Hugh's position. I'm not sure. I mean, at the federal level, there's usually a variety of change to the tax code, tax increases, and so on and so forth. We'll often talk about top tax brackets for sure, but I think there's a lot. I mean, particularly at the federal level, a little bit less so at the provincial level, but at the federal level, there's so much space on the corporate side. It's really quite shocking. I mean, most Canadians have no idea that the corporate tax rate has been halved the federal corporate tax rate has been halved over the last 12 years. That Canadian corporations pay the lowest effective tax rate in the industrialized world. And most Canadians don't know that, right? And so we can repeat it as much as we like, and a lot of reporters sometimes don't even believe us, right? And you can say, well, KPMG did the study last year, and went from this date to that date. And so there's, that's focusing a bit more on the corporate side. I think that what was interesting about the income inequality data that came out just yesterday, looking at the top 1% of Canadians, how much they make, how that's changed over time, really has illustrated again this vast divergence in wealth creation and share of income that's moved up the scale to the top 5% and the top 1%. What was fascinating for me was that in the 3 biggest cities in the country, Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, in every single one of those cities, the bottom 90% make less today than they did in 1982, adjusted for inflation, right? Mm-hmm. So this is the promise of economic growth in Canada, dashed for a generation of Canadians that live in our big cities, right? No, the top 1% in those cities did spectacularly well. In Calgary, top 1% makes $600,000 more than they did in 1982, right? Just a dramatic increase in income. And so, with growing income inequality, I think it makes some sense to use the tax system to offset the pre-tax inequality. I think there are larger issues of growing the bottom end of the spectrum. I mean, that's the other side of the equation, is that the bottom 90% have seen no wage growth in 30 years, and that's a serious problem. Maybe that has to do with unions and globalization and so on and so forth, but I mean, there's the AFB sort of deals a bit more on the tax side. Anyway.
Would anyone else like to add that, or you?
Well, I just wanted to add that the whole idea of like everyone should pay their fair share, everyone should pony up, is again this individualized market-driven idea of how funding should work, right? As opposed to the idea of the public good. So in the education example, we now can only talk about this as like each, my right to an education. But in addition to one's right to an education, what public funding of education is about is one's right to live in an educated society. And that's a very different frame, right? And I think that we have to be careful about buying into the kind of individual market-driven language and push back with the language of the common good, the public good.
Well, I was going to say, I agree with everything that's been said so far, but sometimes the numbers can be shocking enough to make people at least reflect. So I'm going to quote this stat completely wrong, so please don't quote me on it. But something like, for example, and this is a good example, is that if every family, I think it was every family in Ontario paid, I think it was $250 more in their taxes, and whether their children went to university or not, I think we could cut tuition in half in Ontario, and so or it was make it free. Like it was a very big tuition reduction, if not eliminate tuition fees. And so I think that just looking at the power that we have as a tax base in terms of getting the services that we want from our province is interesting, at least.
I mean, the one thing I'd say too, just building on what my fellow panelists have said is, education is supposed to be the thing that allows people to move, and I'm worried. I mean, the fact that people haven't moved in 30 years and the average person hasn't, to me, is pointing to a weakness in that education system to facilitate that sort of movement, and whatever could be done to help improve that situation, I'd be in favor of.
First, I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of the events for putting together an excellent panel. I learned so much, and thank you for everyone coming out tonight on a freezing rain evening. So I have so many things going on in my head right now because it would be nice to have so many more people in the room. But I want to start by saying, giving my left credentials, because I'm going to ask a question that's kind of controversial, and that I'm actually interested in picking your brains on it about the messaging. I'm from York University, graduate of CCPA, been on strike with that union, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I wholly believe in the right to public education. I work on public services, access to water and sanitation. Here's the question. I'm wondering what's happening to post-secondary education where, as Joel is describing to us, we're turning towards jobs training, away from the sort of liberal arts. Actually, we're here to emancipate ourselves. I do a lot of work in Venezuela where the discussion is moving to let's actually educate for revolution, right? I mean, these kinds of things are possible. They're so far behind. We're so far behind anything talking about education for those purposes. But before I started my job at the University of Ottawa, I went to a dinner with someone who was taking a first-year geology class. He needed it to get his BA or something. And so the first day, the prof is jumping off the walls, talking about rocks, and he says to himself, am I that excited about anything that I'm learning here? Nope. I think I'll become a chef. So the question to the panel is to pick your brains on what is going on that we're expanding post-secondary education to become what the province seems to think is a second high school. Is that smart? And why is it that we don't see trades as something that's valuable in our society anymore? Like to become an electrician, a plumber, what's going on? Why are we?
Those complaints just came out.
We're in this mess.
Whole editorial on that. The decline of trades, the demand totally exceeding the supply, and the overproduction of university degrees, and the opposite, people with BAs being baristas and so forth, the underemployment generation.
But I'm particularly worried about the student response of this, because I don't think it's responsible to say that outside of this room, depending on who's in the room. Do you see what I mean? So I think that's what I want to know strategically from you guys. What is your thinking, and then maybe
I mean, what's really interesting about college level data and the trades is that there is no data, right? There's no data on tuition rates. There's no data on, well, there's data on enrollment, but there's just no aggregate data on how much people are paying in the colleges. The only reason why we have any historical data at all is there's a woman in Manitoba who decided to call up a whole bunch of the schools at the start of every year for the past 20 years and ask them how much their tuition is. That's the only reason we have data at all. It's not weighted by enrollment like the university data is from StatsCan. There is no StatsCan study across the country that has this data. This data does not exist. And so at least from a starting perspective in terms of trying to figure out, is there an economic incentive or disincentive to go into the trades? How much are people paying? How long is it taking? Nobody knows because there's no research in that. There's no global Canadian-wide study of those types of institutions at all.
It's funny. I think, and this is my response, and I truly believe this, if you eliminate all tuition fees from undergraduate to college to graduate degrees, I think you'll really see a reassessment of where the stigma is assigned to in education. So for example, why does medical school and why does law school cost so much? Do they really learn that much more? Does it really take up that many more resources? Or is it this idea of prestige and it costs so much because it's prestigious, right? And so I think that's one of the ways to address it. And I think that sort of ideology will permeate with high school students because they'll look at things and be like, well, what do I truly want to do? And I think that's important. And I do think that we are, especially if you haven't read the discussion paper that was released by the MTCU, I would read it. It's very interesting. We are moving away from this liberal arts academy. And I think it's problematic in so many ways because we keep saying, oh, it's a knowledge-based economy. The bachelor's degree is the new entry-level degree that you need to get a stable job. But it's like the jobs that people are talking about are no longer there. And I think there's a disconnect between what we're educating ourselves for and what the labor market actually looks like. And should we be tailoring one to the other, actually? Or so.
That might require planning. Not like the anarchy of the market.
So my solution to that is eliminate tuition fees, but.
I like the planning. I mean, the planning issue. I see a lot of students who end up in business schools who should never be in a business school, but they've been pushed there because they were told that's the way to get a good job. And they're in many cases they've been pushed there by very well-intentioned people who care the most about them. In many cases, their parents and their relatives and whatnot, or their guidance counselors and so. But it's bad. It's kind of like taking health advice just from your mom. If I was to listen to my mom, I'd be taking every vitamin known to man, but it would save me from everything that I could ever possibly contract. And she's extremely well-intentioned, but she's sadly not the right person to be advising on health. And I think that it's the same sort of situation where it comes to career planning and educational planning. And so a lot of decisions that are made that are really inappropriate. Is a business degree going to hurt them? Maybe. Probably just morally though. But place for them? Probably not. And so it would be great to see more effort, more emphasis to make that decision an informed one. Make it crafted out of research and data and those sorts of things, rather than being based on the gut instincts of well-intentioned people.
To say one quick thing, I mean, first of all, you're right. We need to increase the status of the trade. There's obviously nothing wrong with becoming a carpenter or a plumber or anything else. At the same time, embedded in your question was the fact if universities return to the ideal of a liberal arts education and were not so much about job training, then the idea of what profession you were going into wouldn't be the only reason to get a university education, right? But I don't think that university education is for everyone, and it shouldn't have to be, right? The problem is that
rowing upstream on that one, however, if I may.
What's that?
You're rowing upstream on that one, however. The general consensus is that education is a universal right that everyone ought to pursue.
Absolutely, but the problem is what we know from history, right? Which is that if you say, well, not everyone needs a university education, what you're starting to create is there will be certain groups of people who never get a university education, and it won't be based on individuals. It'll be based on either the color of your skin or what neighborhood you come from, or whatever else. Guidance counselors will say, you university education, you plumber, right? Yes. And that's the fear. That's why, and you're saying it, why people are scared to discuss that outside of these kind of rooms. because that's the worry. But I think that it is a really important point.
I just kind of elaborate this. Have other people seen that Maclean's editorial? You know what I'm talking about? And it's not someone mentioned Germany there, and exactly what you just said happens with the guidance counselor. They do that in the Netherlands, in Germany. I'm not sure about Scandinavia, but it's not uncommon in what people consider very advanced societies for people to try to identify children's gifts and steer them into these different paths, even within the high schools. They have the gymnasium and then what they call it, the more trades or Asian school, one they do Greek and Latin and whatnot, or Sanskrit or whatever. And so I'm wondering about this too. I mean, I just got my PhD in 2011 teaching visual contract at St. Paul University. And I go to the American Academy of Religion, a conference of 15,000 people now at the SPL. They had a major panel that they did a few years ago on the job market, and they concluded they had like 10 people present something like what you did tonight. Negative, negative, negative across the board. And they all said, we all have bad news for you, but you have to hear it. There's too many PhDs, not enough positions, tenure is being eroded, many people will never get jobs. If you want to do something remotely related to what you studied, you may want to look into like publishing, working in an NGO, or maybe you should just think of something completely different. And they said, these are just the facts, folks, that universities are creating, they're recruiting people, they're ballooning their PhD programs without making people aware that after your 7-8 years you've been in this program, you're going to come out and there won't be a position for you. And they're doing this, and when they see another place that opens up multiple spots, a university that says, well, we just want to keep a few spots because then we can give the kind of attention to mentoring and so forth, but then we won't be able to compete. So the market mentality has, I'm not sure when this shift happened, but the business model for universities seems to be endemic. And at least within, I can't speak for other disciplines, but certainly within religious studies, theology, philosophy, and I've just anecdotally seen it. I mean, departments being melded so that, at UBC, there's a department of Near Eastern Classics and Religious Studies. Here you have Classics, Religious Studies. And other places just scrap these things all together. It's like, well, who's going to get a job at that, right? And so I'm just wondering, there's a whole paradigm of universities in our country. Does that have to shift for people to not only make space for the honorable pursuit of the trades, but also allow university to be what they're meant to be, as someone said, without having to conform themselves to some other end?
I mean, one of the things that, not really good at. I think the other thing that's happening too is that even if people are taking university with the goal of getting a job as a business something or other, or as a plumber, or as a whatever, oftentimes the planning for that is pretty poor. So maybe in 2005, you started your business, your 4-year business degree, and you thought, I'm going to graduate, I'm going to kill a job on Bay Street. And you graduate in 2009. Right? Is that your fault? No, it's not your fault. But you got a big debt load now, right? And so there are, in fact, on average, over the long term, students will do better with a university degree than with a high school degree. But the fact is that what program you graduated and what year you graduated is going to have a big impact on the rest of your life. And in this growing shift from public to private in terms of risk and who's gaining that risk, we're shifting the risk of graduating at the wrong time with the wrong degree, going into the wrong area that you thought was going to be good 4 years ago, turns out it wasn't, and now you've got a big debt. And so this risk now falls on your lap. It used to fall on the public's lap in the sense that they paid a bunch for you to go to university. It didn't work out, you're going to have to go back to university or whatever. But now that shift is towards the students who are now paying much higher tuition, much higher debt loads. And through no fault of their own, they may end up in the wrong place at the wrong time.
I think as well, one of the things is that when I talk about elimination of tuition fees, I say for all post-secondary education, which includes colleges. I do think it's important for people to pursue post-secondary education, but that could be a trade, or that could be a graduate degree or a bachelor's degree. And the other thing is this idea of, well, we're graduating too many PhD students, and we're encouraging everybody to educate themselves as much as they possibly can because we're in a knowledge-based economy and that's what you should do. But, part of it can be taken care of by the fact that we're just eroding tenure, right? It's like we're taking away full-time faculty positions and replacing it with things like contract instructing. And we could really address some of the issues of why I sit in a graduate seminar of 40 people instead of 7, right? With instead of with universities investing in tenured full-time professors, right? And so that might address part of it. And then the other thing is just giving students the option, if they want to do a business degree, go ahead and do a business degree. If they want to do a trade, go ahead and do a trade. But disciplines that were supposed to be rooted in the liberal arts, we need to still be allowing that type of education to happen, because a different type of stigma is being attached to it, right? Like, you're not going to get a job and the risk is on you and things like that. And when did that become a bad thing, and when did that no longer have a place in our society? And that's essentially what's being told to students at this point, is like, yeah, but you won't get a job. And if bachelor's degree is the point of entry for the job market, then why not a liberal arts degree? We had somebody who presented at one of our conferences the other day, or meeting, a Canadian Federation of Students meeting, and she was a bureaucrat at the MTCU, and she was saying, I'm so glad I got a liberal arts degree because I'm a critical thinker, I can write, I can communicate, and so many people in the government are saying, in terms of bureaucrats, we're hiring these people, but they don't have critical analysis skills, or they don't have writing, or they don't have communication skills. And it's like, maybe that's a little bit of a glistening hope that we can start to see a return of that.
Graham at the back, and then we get the gentleman at the hat.
I think related to a lot of this, and you just hit on it there, is that the extent to which that pressure to go to university is in fact driven by government, which is a politically salient thing to do, which is to take sort of the natural and continuous concern of parents about the success of their children, and a growing anxiety about their ability to be successful, and to sort of say, well, you're worried, so they should go to university, that will make them successful, so we're going to continuously expand the system, or at least increase the amount of students in the system. Whether or not the quality is the same is another matter entirely. But I think it's kind of the symptom of a similar thing as we've been talking about in austerity, and about the way in which governments respond to this deficit situation. This is a laser-like focus on expenditures and almost no consideration on revenue. That's sort of been the missing piece in this debate all along. But in the higher education sector, it sort of has this strange thing where it's, well, we sort of take this reality now that university grads aren't getting jobs, so there's something wrong with university, not with the labor market, right? And so that sits in as this kind of laser, and that's the entire genesis of that reform program that came out of MTCU last year. Was that, like, somehow our universities are failing to plug students into like all these jobs that just are out there without qualified or skilled people to fill them. So I mean, and I think that's I think it's just an entire shift about how governments start to think. Because 10 years ago, they weren't super interested in that file, in the higher education file, and now they're in some ways kind of obsessively interested in that file, because they feel like it's a way out of this trap of sort of dying labor markets, which they're somewhat complicit in, for trading away the prosperity of 3 decades.
I'd love to throw something in there, and it may be something that David could pick up on or like too, is the idea that when unemployment is up around 8%, and youth unemployment is double or more of that,
14.
Then not quite. Then the pressure and the emphasis on universities and colleges to create jobs and that is more intense. I mean, if you had that unemployment rate lower, we maybe wouldn't be worried quite so much about this, because if you had an environment that was creating jobs and creating opportunities for all, the great sorting process would kind of work itself out a little bit better. And so, is part of this kind of going back to a jobs and growth strategy, that really what we need is not necessarily tweaking or changing the university system, but in fact a greater emphasis on creating jobs and creating growth.
I think that's well said. I think that using university education and meritocracy generally as an exit from actually addressing inequalities in society, inequalities in the job market, I think it's exactly as you're saying. I mean, you're saying, well, you got your shot. We gave you a little grant. You get your 30% tuition grant if you happen to be lucky, and you're unemployed. You didn't work hard enough. Sorry, it's your fault, right? That there is that shift to the private, and I think you're very right. It's very much in line with that meritocratic, neoclassic approach to economic growth. It's everyone for themselves, and if you didn't make it, then you're stupid and you didn't work very hard.
Person with the hat?
Yeah, just out of curiosity, was brought up before the commodification of students as to funding the universities, and that's one of the reasons the programs continue to expand and all the rest. The university is a business. But one thing that hasn't been brought up yet, I realize it's probably not realistic based on that commodification of students, but we had mentions of zero tuition, potentially solving some problems, going out, putting the emphasis back to the tax base to pay for things. What about potentially restricting programs and universities more, which was kind of touched on a little bit, but things like education, like departments of education, where they're graduating way more teachers than jobs exist every year, knowingly, because there was a shortage and they just never called it back again. Same thing starting to happen in nursing schools. Same thing is starting to happen in nursing. Huge demand. They've massively increased class sizes across the province. So we're still fine, but given 5-6 years down the road, those students will probably be in the exact same boat that education's in now. So just throwing it up to the panel, because you all know far more about economics than I do, what do you think about the potential of not worrying about tuition fees at all, worrying about restricting the programs down smaller so that there's more competition, not on the back end when you're done, but competition on the front end, coming in or trying to fight to be there, so that potentially there's more of a market for those jobs and for that training. Now, admittedly, it doesn't necessarily apply to a liberal arts degree, more so to some of the professional programs, but I just wanted to know your thoughts on that side of the coin. Instead of expanding it, calling it back to potentially have the same net effect.
Let me just start by in the education, just so other people know, and you clearly do. I mean, just to give you an example, here at the University of Ottawa, we take in about 850 Anglophone students in the teacher education program and about 600 or more Francophone students in a sort of parallel teacher education program, right? Right now in Ottawa, not only are there 0 teaching jobs, but they're not even accepting teachers onto the supply list, right, or substitute teachers. So our graduates can't even get on the supply list, like for temporary assignments for teaching, right?
6,000 unemployed teachers in the region right now, and I'm pretty sure those stats only include the ones that are still actively seeking teaching jobs. As opposed to people who I have many friends who graduated, like this is my second degree. I have many friends who graduated from education. I almost went into education.
Yeah. And so
instead of nursing instead, but most of them aren't working directly in teaching.
And so of course, this isn't going to surprise you, especially based on Anna's comments, but of course our response, our institutional response is to turn around within 2 months of the beginning of their teacher education program, we turn around to recruit them to enter the master's program, right? Because that way we still continue to draw cash from the students, and it's like morally bankrupt. There's no other way to say it. What I'm not sure, and I'll turn over to my colleagues on the panel, is the problem is those students are a cash cow, right? So they're funding the program, so reducing the number of students, of course, isn't going to change isn't going to close the funding shortfall, right?
Depends how much you reduce it by.
Yeah.
So, sorry, go ahead. No, absolutely.
I don't have anything to say.
Okay, sorry. This reference is for my fellow West Wing fan over here. I'm going to reject the premise of the question. I actually don't think that restricting class size is the way to go about things. Firstly, if you keep tuition fees on the track that they're at now, universities become more and more of elitist institutions for only those who can afford them, is the first thing. The other thing is when we restrict class sizes, that's saying, especially when it's merit-based, and so you're saying compete, it's like, what about the students who really worked hard and didn't have support systems that more privileged students might have had throughout their high school degrees, but they really do want a post-secondary education and want to get in and can't because it's restricted so much, and two, can't afford it. Is the other thing, right? And so with the elimination of tuition fees, I think we make it a level playing field. The other thing is like, I reject the notion of education as job training. Like, what about learning for the sake of learning because it's an exciting thing and it makes you better and question things and be critical, right? And I think we think of it now as a frivolous thing because education does cost so much to us personally, that risk is on you, that if you want to engage in this risky behavior of getting a degree in something that doesn't match up to a job, that was your own frivolous behavior, right? It was like, you know, it's like, I'm just getting an education. And I think, for example, with the teacher idea, like pardon me?
It's like, don't drink and drive, don't think and drive.
Yeah, right? It's like, and so the thing with becoming a teacher is like, but what if you grew up and in your kindergarten class you had your kindergarten teacher who blew your mind and all you wanted to do for the rest of your life was become a teacher, and you get to university and you're told, well, there's not enough jobs for you. And you're like, but I just want to learn to become a teacher. Like, maybe, okay, fine, I won't be hired as a teacher next year when I graduate, but what if maybe when I have kids, I'm able to help educate them better, or, right? Like, why not acquire that knowledge because you have a thirst for it? And I think that this idea of commodification of education plays into those policy ideas, and I think we're just generally looking at post-secondary education in the wrong way.
I'd just say too, though, just in terms of my concern would be about limiting people in is we don't always know exactly the route we're going to take, or you know, when people are going to flourish and how their path may change, and so I'd worry a little bit that if we started constraining entrance, that we may be losing out on a lot of things that we don't anticipate coming afterwards.
So just a brief announcement and then a suggestion. The announcement is I'd like to remind you that you should feel free to talk about what initiatives you're involved with and share stories and strategies. So don't be shy if you've got some things you'd like to talk about. Also, I'm going to suggest we take a couple of questions and then hand it over to the panel. We've got, or how about we'll say three. We've got the gentleman here, we've got somebody there, and we've got somebody right there, and someone on deck later.
All right, I agree with a lot of the issues that have been brought up, and I've heard the horror stories of planning, particularly locally, and I've seen them happen before. The whole issue of a meritocracy and whether we should or not restrict access to higher education is not a simple issue. There's a consequence to having a broad base of students across the entire merit/intellectual capacity basis in higher education. I would dearly love to get rid of the bottom third of my classes. I'm sorry. I teach engineering. My background is math and physics. We are a professional program. Part of our profession is focused on public safety. We have to make sure our students know their stuff because they have a professional responsibility to do it properly and not kill somebody. I have serious doubts about some of my students, and those that I have serious doubts, I tell them to go away. My dean, don't tell my dean. But there are these concerns about not only what is best for the individual, but also what is best, as you put it, for the public good, for the, if you will, the commons. And even at the individual level, I paid $857 for my first year's tuition. That's not just a semester, that's a whole year.
79, right?
82, but in Manitoba. Okay, I'm a geek. I have some vague understanding of human psychology. If you don't have skin in the game, you don't put forth the effort. And we're not going to raise the boat. We're not going to increase the GDP, to use a crude metric, unless we put our shoulders to the wheel collectively. And it's not just an individual thing. I don't know how to solve the problem, except by being brutally honest with individuals and saying, look, what are your interests? What are your abilities? Find the intersection. If you want to be a teacher, but you suck at it. But you're fantastic at research.
I guess my question is, really, what is the goal of universities? Is it education, or to me it seems like it's growth, and that universities are not only competing amongst each other, but that they're kind of run like a business. Some of the, I would call them shocking statistics you gave earlier about the surpluses and the fact that we're still facing a 5% tuition increase every year when they're making more and more money. What is that for? I mean, we were told at a budget meeting, the Board of Governors, that they needed more students to fund the students who are already here.
Sounds like a Ponzi scheme.
So in growing the universities, what is the goal if it's an endless
Can I quickly interject at that one? It's an unfortunate reality that we tend to eat the poor students to fund the good ones.
The third hand here, and then back to the panel.
Yeah, you have an interesting question about the eternal growth, and the paradox that it's sustained. I was wondering, though that study, the white paper, there's this idea, I think it's in there, about the two models of universities, the one for research and the ones for education. And when I look at the Quebec university system, I clearly see that the original universities, the University of Quebec, are usually mostly teaching. They do a bit of research, but they are mostly teaching. And then you have the big important universities in Montreal, Sherbrooke, and Quebec City that are really great at research. And I'm wondering what would be, you could tell us what would be the consequence of that model here at the University of Ottawa, because they want to become more, they want to be one of the research university, research intensive university, and what would be the consequence for smaller universities? I don't know.
Right, panel. 3 questions to think about.
It's easier to go with the last one. I guess just fresh, but I think it's a very important question. About what kind of system. There have been a number of different pushes across the country. There's been the group of 8 that have said we should be funded differently than the rest, and that. That's very important to us here at Ottawa, because depending on which ranking, we're 10. So we think it should be a group of 10, in order, but then cut everybody else out, right? So you have these sorts of questions about, who's in and who's out. I like the Canadian system historically has been one that has been much more equal across the board. I mean, there's differences between one university to the next, but I remember reading an article, it was kind of like a New Yorker article many years ago, and it was by a Canadian reflecting on Canadian universities and saying, it's kind of funny because they make a big deal about the differences between universities, and yet the funding of them, at least historically, was all the same or pretty similar. Whether you're at one university or the next, the government sort of contribution for your education was the same, and tuition fees were very similar too. And so universities were working with the same sort of pool of resources. Now, they kind of, tended to be focused on one thing and not the other. But that was pretty good. It meant that there was a pretty good uniformity across the country in terms of the types of education you were getting. And I worry about going to a system where you're going to have vastly different education, different experience of education, depending on where you end up. But I mean, I don't. That's not based on any careful analysis of, that the outcomes are necessarily going to be much worse.
The problem, of course, is separating teaching from research probably impoverishes both, right? Not for every, of course, we've all had or been professors who are terrible teachers and who just, should be shut away somewhere in a lab and left to their own devices. But I'd say for a vast majority, right, those two spheres of university life should be complementary, and your research is energized by the kind of dialogues that happen in education, and your teaching is energized by the research you're doing. So I'd be concerned about separating those aspects of university life.
Okay, so 3 more questions. We got the person in the white shirt, we got Mark Rosenfeld, and we got the person in the back.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, so some of the things that I've been thinking about too, coming from this sort of student perspective, are some of the things that we've learned from our comrades in Quebec. But obviously we have a lot of room to grow in Ontario in terms of student resistance against austerity. But what I really was impressed by during the Maple Spring was the fact that at the CEGEPs and at the universities, a lot of the time when the students would have picket lines, the professors would be right there with them. And there's a lot of pictures that came out of the CEGEPs when the profs were basically defending the students from the police. And so I'm kind of wondering, this is more of a question for the profs in the room, but when push comes to shove, will you be there with us?
This actually picks up from what you were saying, because Quebec offered a really interesting development, because it began a conversation, a long conversation, about the funding of universities and the philosophical discussion about what are our universities, how do they integrate with society, should they be publicly funded or not. And it was interesting because we've never had a conversation in Ontario, for example, about the funding of universities. What's happened is very incremental. We've moved towards a system now where 50% of the funding is through student tuition and private sources, but that hasn't been the result of an ongoing discussion, even within government, of what is the rational funding of the university system. It's been based on government decisions on how much they want to spend on higher education. It's been based on the fiscal situation as determined. It's been a matter of choice, actually. And so consequently, accompanying that discussion of funding has been this notion of private versus public benefit. And we think of private benefit, it's been explained in a way that, well, students get a private benefit because they train, they go to the job market, and it's reflected in their earnings. But it's a very narrow definition also of private benefit, because we don't talk about what is the benefit to industry, what is the benefit to other aspects of our economy. We haven't brought in a training tax. And in fact, it is a subsidy, a large subsidy to industry, if we want to narrowly define what higher education does. And so we have fragments here in very narrow and selective interpretations when we talk about higher education and how it's supported. And what direction we need to move towards, which we did begin in Quebec and hopefully will continue, is the nature of our higher education system, the funding of our higher education system. And that's pushed back to a larger philosophical discussion of public versus private benefit and public versus private responsibility. Until we get to that discussion, we're going to continue along this incremental path of increasing privatization without any rationale that everybody's gone into. And we know there's pushback from the domestic public because they're concerned about the costs. But, obviously because people are suffering now and the economy they're feeling the effects of a contracting economy. But what we need to do is move towards a wider discussion that as yet hasn't taken place.
And for those of you who don't know, Mark is the executive director of CUFA. I don't know if we had an introduction at the beginning. So we have a third person asking a question, then we're going to go to the panel, then we're going to go back for one last round of 3. And when we take that last round, I am going to keep gender parity in mind because we've had a lot of men asking questions, and I see there are lots of women in the room. So another question, back to the panel, and then I think we got time for 3 more questions.
So my question, it touches a bit on what my comrade here talked about, and it's for the teachers or the professors of the University of Ottawa. I'm a fan of the Board of Governors. I go there all the time where I watch the videos, and I think it's really important for us to do that. What has come a lot, and even when I discuss on this side with some of the members or the government, is that $7 out of 10 or 7% goes to the teachers. And I really feel this kind of tension when we want to address the financial question of higher fees, is that teachers get paid a lot, and they're basically, they don't say that way, but it's almost like it's their fault. And plus, their pension fund is really something that's really horrible because they will all retire really soon, and that's why we need to stockpile money. So I was just wondering what would be your because I suck with numbers, so I don't know what to tell them. But I need
Well, I'm living all those numbers right now. We just spent all day Monday in negotiations with the university over pensions. The deficit that you should be worried about, not the deficits you shouldn't be worried about, is about $126 million. So yeah, it is. The pension is definitely something that is an issue with the deficits in that. I'm not sure about the 7 out of 10. I mean, the total wage bill for full-time faculty on campus is about $134 million, compared to about $840 million as a budget. So it's, and I did show up one slide that shows that, expenditures have been pretty flat as a percentage of university expenditures. So I'm not totally sure about those, but we might be talking about slightly different numbers. But as a percentage, if you look over a longer period of time, what's kind of interesting is that while it's been kind of flat through the 2000s, you go back to the 80s, and in fact, the amount that is spent on faculty salaries has declined as a percentage of university expenditures. You're now, the numbers that I work with and know are somewhere around 34%, somewhere in that sort of neighborhood. And so it is expensive. I think that there has been a disappointing movement in the past 10 years where we've seen the increase in terms of courses taught on campus by non-full-time people. You're talking about now, I mean, that was part of our last collective bargaining team, and it was raised during those bargaining sessions that 50% of courses taught on the University of Ottawa campus are taught by part-time people, and those people are paid much less than what the academics are paid. And I will say that I feel we as faculty members, and myself included, have perhaps been assuaged by decent salary increases over the past 10 years that maybe have distracted us from the fact that our teaching mandate has diminished on campus. So that's concerning. That's definitely concerning to me. In terms of the Board of Governors and that, my concern or question is, what's their plan with that $350 million that they've accumulated over over the past 10 years. I think it's great from, like I say, from a business school perspective, I think it's great that we have money in the bank and we have some savings, but I worry that it's been at the expense of expenditures on core teaching types of activities. See, more of that happen, in terms of more expenditures into these sorts of things. I will say, and this is perhaps a bit mean of me, but I've been to a few board of governors meetings, and my complaint or concern is that the level of oversight when I was there, and I've been there in a couple of years, so maybe it's different now, but was really weak. I remember seeing a university budget pass, and one question was asked, one question, and it was about how one number was calculated. Not whether it was a good number, right? But and how did you get to that number? Oh, right, and this and this and that, and the budget passed. The budget, $800 million of spending, and you have no questions.
I think it's worse than that. I think last year the tuition hike was passed to. It was passed by email because some friends here shut down the meeting. But but the budget was actually 2 meetings after. So they actually passed the tuition hike before the actual budget, which makes no sense. Why do we increase tuition fees? Well, you may have some budget problems, but no, not here at this university.
Yeah, it's just the principle of it. My immediate reaction is like 70% of the budget goes to teachers. I mean, of course. I mean, what else does a university do? I mean, education is about relationships between the professor and the student. I mean, where else do you want to spend your money? I guess the only thing I think of is administrative offices, or so. I'm being a little facetious, but we heard Anna's statistics. She's in graduate classes with 40 students. When I went to graduate school, I was in grad seminars with 7 and 8 and 10 students, and the graduate courses I teach have 40 students in them. That's not a graduate program. I'm sure 70% is some bizarre inflation by the Board of Governors, who, by the way, I'm sure every single one of them make 2, 3, 4, 5 times as much as any professor. But yeah, where else would you put your money in education? Education is about relationship and about the teaching relationship.
Yeah, I would just say on that 70% thing, of course, that is all staff. It is not just pure teaching, academic staff at the university.
Yeah.
And we know it takes a lot of people doing all kinds of things to make it run. So push back, because what is a university about but people? And so why wouldn't you invest in people? I mean, what the heck else? Joel put it very well.
Yeah. Constance's exactly right. That is right. That's where the 70. That's exactly the number. I'm sorry, I didn't even realize. That's all staff. That's perfect.
But push back from that. Ask the board. What are you going to invest in? Bricks and mortar?
The years are really good also at hiding numbers, hiding, there was a war, the argument with the Fédération étudiante universitaire du Québec, with the CREPUC, conférence des recteurs présidents de l'Université du Québec, the FEUC telling CREPUC that they were actually hiding a big chunk of their budget into the immobilization funds. So infrastructure funds. So basically, of course, you're going to create a crisis by manipulating the numbers. So I think if they give you the 70%, they might be another more numbers.
Yeah, I just have 2 quick points to address some of the questions. One of the ones was on differentiation in terms of research and teaching institutions. My question to that is, where are you going to put graduate students? You're going to put them at the research institutions with professors there, so they're going to research things, but who are they going to teach? Who are they going to be teaching assistants for? So then you're going to be creating all these graduate students who are great researchers, but who are your prof's going to be, and they're going to have no teaching experience, and you're going to have more of those professors who, you've had that one time where you've had a professor who would be much better in a lab or doing research, and you're just perpetuating like a weird imbalance, which doesn't make any sense, right? And you're splitting apart pieces of a puzzle that are supposed to fit together, that were designed to fit together with undergraduate, graduate, and faculty. So that's what I think. And then the other thing, we talked a little bit about Quebec. I'm from Quebec. I started my time in the student movement in Quebec as well. And I think something that's really interesting that people don't point to here is that there's a culture that because tuition fees are so high, students here in high school even start working to save up money, for university, and then when they get to university, they're working 1, 2, 3 part-time jobs, and we can see StatsCan has released data on students are working more and more and more in their degrees to pay for tuition fees, so people don't have time to mobilize. And it's really convenient for governments to keep increasing tuition fees because they're essentially immobilizing students because they don't have enough free time to have these debates and get out and talk about it and talk about access to education. So I think that's part of the reason why we need to fight for tuition fee reduction, is so that we can gain more supporters and we can have more people who can engage in things other than just outside the classroom and going to work.
We have about 3 minutes, and I've promised 3 more questions. So I'm going to recommend that we have 3 questions. Melissa, do you want to say something?
Well, I can pose it as a question to the group, or I can say something.
Why don't you say something?
Oh, can I just say one quick thing? You asked whether professors would be supporting you on the picket line. I just want to answer yes.
And I think that the professors, on behalf of the professors, probably need you to support them as well. That this is part of what this is about, is that we all have issues, and I'm not actually on this campus, but everybody here has issues, and mutual support is going to be needed because you're not each other's bad guys. And then we've been collecting contact information on this sign-up sheet here, so if you haven't provided yours and you're interested, please do. And I wanted to put it to the group. Any suggestions on what to do with it? I think this is a good starting point where we're getting different groups of people together to have this conversation. It would be excellent if people were able to be in touch with each other and continue it. And I'm not sure what the best forum would be to kind of have that happen.
The inter-union.
We have somebody here who has been waiting very patiently.
I'm also, I think I'm an organizer right now in our faculty association. It's probably what I'm best described as. I've been elected as the chair of the Strike Mobilization Committee, and I just want to say that we have to take credit in Canada for the kinds of resources that we have. And one of the resources that we have that makes us very different from the United States of America is that we have faculty unions. We have nearly 100% density in the province of Ontario. It doesn't mean they're all certified unions, but that means that the only way that professors sometimes can force the university to do something is to go on strike, in my opinion. And it's becoming increasingly discussed in our union, and it's a very exciting time to be at AQO because last round of bargaining, the union actually informed our members about what we were bargaining about, which might seem like shocking as a revelation, but was actually a big cultural change in our union, which has historically been quite secretive about what's happening. So there are large changes going on, and it's very exciting, and there's a lot of work to be done. That being said, I think we have to use the collective agreement and the tools that we have, and one of the things that I am thinking more and more about is that Wilfrid Laurier, they have language in their collective agreement on faculty-student ratios. They're the only ones in the country that have that language. They got it 10 years ago. What it does is it forces the employer, the collective agreement is about curtailing the management rights. The university, as you've heard from us, their interest is get you guys, your bums in seats. They don't know how you get there. It's like an airline. They don't care about the quality of your ride. More. We face this daily. More graduate students, more students, bigger classes, etc. So we have an interest together to build these coalitions in terms of the students and the profs. We're in the same boat. We're being overworked. You're getting shitty education. We also have a lot of interest with the part-time professors who are also a result of this system of the graduate student influx, this delaying the labor market. And so what I would like to see is more political pressure and coalitions as well about hiring people in decent jobs instead of the precarious work that's being going down. It dawned on me that the part-time professors are an issue of subcontracting, where at some point the union let go and said, hey, other people can start doing our work that aren't members of our bargaining
I've
unit.
been
How did
ranting about
happen?
that for years.
I know, it's like ridiculous. So we need to do a lot of work together, and there's interests that we have in common that I think we need, and this is what the importance of these kinds of fora are, and credit to Elpufa for creating the event, for putting the people in the room. I think it's awesome.
So we have about 1 minute
Strike.
left, and we've got one last question or comment that's been promised. Does anyone want to ask one last question or comment before I turn over to the panel? I'm going to ask each panel member to speak for no more than 30 seconds in their response. And then I'm going to ask Constance if she wants to wrap things up with a brief.
No, I'm going to let her.
Okay, 30 seconds each.
One final point that I wanted to make was really following up on Mark's comment that as we continue to privatize university education, as it becomes a goal in of itself to get a job and the benefit and the costs are privatized, that the public benefit of having professionals that don't have massive debt loads and aren't essentially taught through the university system to only look out for themselves, that there is a public good that is being lost. If we take professionals like doctors or lawyers who might have gone into those professions because they wanted to help people or they wanted to cure people, but end up at the end of those professions with heavy debt loads and realizing they need to be specialists, they cannot be primary care docs, they can't work for that human rights NGO they wanted to work for, they got to work for Bay Street because that's the only way they can make money, that we all suffer, despite the fact these people are going to make more money because they have these degrees. There's my.
Well, this has been great. It's good to see so many people coming out when they don't have to talk about these things. I think that my greatest hope is to see higher education become part of the national discussion, and I don't think it is right now. And I think that that's extremely dangerous in an age of austerity. That if it doesn't become a public priority and soon, that the squeeze is going to be really devastating on the whole thing. And we've seen that in the U.S. We've seen dismantling of the California State University system and these sorts of things. That is a disaster. Should be seen as a disaster.
I think that I want to echo what a few people have said at the end here, especially you, that solidarity is really the answer here, because what we're experiencing is a real bifurcation of the educational agenda of a university and the financial corporate agenda of the university. And the only pushback against the corporate agenda is a united front among basically academic workers, which include professors, grad students, part-time professors, and even staff. And that's, I think, the way to move forward.
Yeah, and just to echo that, I think it works in governments who are have these austerities agendas favor to pit groups against other groups who have common interests. So domestic students against international students, faculty against students, graduate students against undergraduate students, contract instructors with full-time faculty, right? And I think all of our goal is to have an accessible, high-quality, public post-secondary education system, and we can gain that if we're working together.